So we are in 2 Kings chapter 7. And what I want to do is I want to read the first couple verses, and then I'm just going to give you a teaser in the first two verses, and then we'll kind of see what this is all about. So in verse 1 of chapter 7, it says, "But Elisha said," so you can tell we're kind of in a middle of something here, "Hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow, about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel, at the gate of Samaria." Then the captain, on whose hand the king leaned, said to the man of God, "If the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be?" And Elijah said, "You will see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it." Well, that's just a little teaser here. So it sounds like Elisha here is almost like a commodities broker forecaster. You know, he's hey, how you guys doing? He's like, "Are in my right class?" It does sound like Elisha is kind of a commodities broker here, doesn't it? He's forecasting what the price of 2 basic commodities will be the next day. It's not something you expect a man of God to be doing, talking about what futures are of some basic commodity. That's the first thing I thought of when I read that. So why is he making this point? Why is he saying what's the price of 2 basic commodities will be? And why does the captain, who's listening here, and we'll get to more about later, he's so he finds it unrealistic. I mean, he very sarcastically says, if God himself opened windows, how could this thing be? Well, to get context, we need to go back one chapter. And we're going to look in chapter 6. We'll start at verse 24. But before we get there, let me refresh a little bit from where Steve and Tom have been over the last couple weeks. Steve mentioned last week, and I'm sure Tom has mentioned it as well, that we have Israel divided into 2 kingdoms. We have, I think Steve pointed on the map, we have 10 kingdoms in the north, and we have 2 kingdoms in the south. One's called Israel, one is called Judah. And the northern kingdom, which is what we're going to talk about today, that consists of 10 tribes, it has a capital, and the capital is Samaria. That's the capital, and that's important to remember as we read these 2 verses in chapter 6. So if you're in chapter 6, let's look at verse 24. And it says, "And afterward, Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, mustered his entire army and went up and besieged Samaria." Remember, this is the capital. "And there was a great famine in Samaria as they besieged it, until a donkey's head was sold for 80 shekels of silver, and the 4th part of a cab of dove's dung or poop for 5 shekels of silver." Interesting, the contrast we have between the 4 verses we've read, huh? We had one verse that said that barley would only be just a shekel or 2, and now we're looking at a verse that says that a donkey's head sells for 80 shekels of silver. What a contrast. So what we have here is we see that the king of Syria, Ben-Hadad, has mustered what the Bible says, its entire army, almost like a blitzkrieg. He just brings it all in there. He's going to just make sure he can bring all of his forces in at one time. And what he does is he surrounds Samaria. Now picture Samaria with it has walls around it, which you'll see mentioned, and it has gates. And so they've surrounded this city, and they've besieged it. Does anybody else's Bible say it differently? That's, ESV says besieged. Anybody else say it different? But essentially you could say surrounded. And so what you have is now you've got the city on lockdown. Sound familiar? But a little different than what we know. But the city is literally on lockdown. The gates are closed. Everybody that's in Samaria, Tom, do you have any idea what the population of Samaria might have been at the time?
No,
Are we talking millions or thousands?
Large.
Yeah.
Comparatively.
Yeah, right, no doubt. Yeah, I mean, it's the capital city. Capital cities usually are, well, not always large. Thinking of Jefferson City, Missouri, it's not very large.
So Jericho wasn't big. Jericho was not
very big, yeah. But we know that strategically it's extremely important. If you shut down the capital, you shut down the lifeline to the country in some ways. So what happens is you have a lockdown, and now everything that's inside the city, there's nobody going in, and really nobody coming out. Now people could come out if you wanted to surrender to the Syrians, but there's nothing going in. So you have basically you could say the supply lines are shut off. There's no food coming in. So whatever's inside the walls of Samaria, that's it. And we saw a couple years ago what happens when demand exceeds supply.
People panic.
Oh yeah, well, people panic. That's a good point too. I remember going into some grocery stores, like you probably remember. It's amazing which Campbell's soups people don't like. Cream of celery is not a popular soup. I learned that because that's about all I could find. But you start buying brands that you don't typically buy. You don't buy, the off-brand. You like Del Monte. You don't like whatever the store brand is. But you were buying whatever you could find, and things that you'd never tried before. Okay, I'll give it a shot. It was a grocer's dream come true. I mean, especially a startup that maybe had just put a product out and it was, I don't know if you know much about grocers, but you have to buy space on shelves. Grocers have to pay for space in grocery stores. So it costs them to make the product, to advertise it, and then pay for space on a grocery shelf. And so for those people, man, I mean, everything was selling. So we saw what a shortage looks like, but this is magnified 50 times, because while we had a supply chain issue, there were still trucks bringing it in. We just had no restaurants open and nobody could go out to eat, so everybody had to go to the grocery store. So, things like toilet paper, which we never thought would be an issue, became an issue. And a lot of us had to use toilet paper that was very inferior to, not your Charmin Ultra with aloe that I prefer. So we all know about that. Scott toilet paper's pretty rough.
Literally.
Yeah, literally rough. So anyway, what we have here is as supplies dwindle and there's just nothing to buy, we see that this verse says, we read, that a donkey's head we're selling for 80 shekels of silver. Now, that in and of itself should be alarming, because I'm thinking, wait a minute. If a donkey's head sells for 80 shekels of silver, what about the rest of the donkey?
On top of that, it was an unclean animal, so they shouldn't have been eating it anyway.
There you go. So, I mean, obviously they're eating the donkey.
And there's not a lot of meat on a head.
There's not much head. I'm guessing you put it in a soup. I don't know what you do with the donkey's head, but 80 shekels of silver is a pretty steep price.
Eyeballs in the tongue.
Whew. Yeah, but just to play that a little further, this is what I do. I'm thinking to myself, that probably means that there's really no animals left in Samaria, including cats, dogs, pets. I mean, there's no animals left. If they're eating a donkey's head, they're eating
And
anything.
donkeys were their work animals.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, it's like eating Anyway, we'll just leave it at that. But
These
But-
were dire circumstances.
no doubt, on whether they're eating the poop of a dove, and it's selling for 4 shekels of silver.
Well, if you want to write down further.
Well, we will. We don't speed me up. Don't speed me up.
We want to hear the other gross stuff.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming. So since Tommy wanted to expedite this a little bit, she wants to get gross here. It is worse than you think. I was trying to paint a picture,
That's fine, girls.
and now we're just going to take verse 26. Since Tommy mentioned it, let's just go there. In verse 26, this is very troubling. Now, as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, saying, "Help, my lord, O king." And he said, "If the Lord will not help you, how shall I help you? From the threshing floor or from the winepress?" And the king asked her, "What is your trouble?" She answered, "This woman," I'm assuming she's pointing to this woman. She says, "This woman said, 'Give me your son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow.' So we boiled my son and ate him." That's just. "And on the next day I said to her, Give your son that we may eat him. But she has hidden her son. When the king heard the words of the woman, he tore his clothes. Now he was passing by on the wall, and the people looked, and behold, he had sackcloth beneath on his body. And he said, May God do so to me, and more also, if the head of Elisha, the son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today. So we have a picture here of a king that it appears to me, he's kind of taking a tour of his city, the capital city, to kind of assess the situation. No doubt he's read the news and he's heard rumors, and his advisors have told him of what the current situation of the city is. But sometimes, as you know, during disasters and things, presidents and governors and so on, they like to get in a helicopter and see it for themselves, right? And so here, that's what you have. You have the king here doing a tour of his city, and based on the response that he gives to this lady when she pleads for help, and he gives a very sarcastic answer, what am I going to do for you? Based on that, what he's seen already has impacted him. He's heard about a lot of these things, but now as he walks through the city, he's very disturbed by what he sees. But when he hears this, he may have heard that people were eating each other, but when you talk to a mother who has ate her son, that'll do stuff to you. I don't care who you are. And this king, how do you I was going to say digest. No. How do you, poor choice of words. How do you comprehend that? How do you comprehend that? That you're looking at a woman, can you imagine talking to a woman who just said that they just ate her son? And now she's complaining that...
That's the worst part. Now
she's complaining that I don't know which is worse. That you ate your son and now you're complaining that your friend won't give her son up. Whew, that's heavy, isn't it? Well, his anxiety quickly turns to anger. And you see who his anger is directed to, the man of God. I wondered this week as I read that Monday, I wonder if that's something we better get ready for. That eventually you will see the anger of this world more directed to Christians. And I think we ought to be prepared for that. And you see what this king did. He proclaims a death sentence on the man of God to Elisha.
That's not smart.
No, it was not smart. Verses 32 and 33. So after this is done, there's a death sentence put on his head. Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Now the king had dispatched a man from his presence, but before the messenger arrived, Elisha said to the elders, Do you see how this murderer has sent to take off my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door and hold the door fast against him. Is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? And while he was still speaking with them, the messenger came down to him and said, This trouble is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? So, as Steve mentioned last week, and he talked a little bit about Elisha. Actually, Steve did a really good job of setting this lesson up for me this week. He mentioned a lot of things that made it a lot easier that I didn't have to go into this week. But he mentioned about Elisha and how powerful he was. And it appears that Elisha, how he finds out, I guess God tells him, but he knows that the king had put a death sentence on his head, and that not only that, he knew that he was going to remove his head from his shoulders. He knew specifics. Not only that, but he also knew that somebody was coming before the king. So he knew details. And so he tells his elders that are with him there, hey, lock the door, deadbolt the door, brace the door. I don't want this messenger coming in. He makes an interesting statement. He says, Elisha says, is not the sound of his master's feet behind him? So he's referring to the king. The king's feet is coming behind him. So let me give you an updated setting here. You'll notice at the end of chapter 6 that Elisha tells his elders, lock the door. because he knew one was arriving before the other. And he wanted that door locked because he knew that he had a message that he wanted to deliver from God. But the messenger or the captain that's coming to do the deed was not the person who the message was directed to. The message was to be directed to the king. So Elisha tells his elders, block the door. I need to buy some time. I need the king to get here, because that's who he's referring to, whose master's feet are behind him. So when we read verse 7, this is the message that is going to be delivered. Just a little tidbit here. You notice it says in verse 1 and 2, let's read verses 1 and 2 because that's our text now, and this is where we're at in our, I'm sorry, let me get there. Hit the wrong thing here. There we go. So in verse 1, it says, so when the messenger gets here and the king gets here, the verse 1 and 2 is the message that Elisha is going to give. It says, but Elisha said, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, tomorrow about this time, a seah of fine flour shall be sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria. Then notice this statement. It's a little odd. Then the captain, on whose hand the king leaned, said to the man. I thought that was interesting. Then the captain, on whose hand the king leaned. Do you have that picture? The king is leaning on the captain's hand.
My Bible says king's right hand man.
It's also describing really positionally his true relationship. This isn't just a dude. This is someone that the king truly leans on heavily for advice, but also in the time when they were traveling, the king leaned on him as they traveled so that he wouldn't fall.
So on that, there is, I don't know, but there is some Bible teachers that think, I don't know, just throwing this as a tidbit, it doesn't really matter, that this is also referring to the king's physical condition, that he had a handicap. And that's one of the reasons that you also have some people that the king is coming behind him. Either either from old age or he had a handicap, but he doesn't come with the messenger. The messenger comes first and the king comes behind him. And then in this situation, some think when it says then the captain on whose hand the king leaned, the king didn't have a choice. He had to lean on him, not just it was figuratively and literally. So I don't know which one, but it's just one of those tidbits. I just throw it out there because it is interesting that you see that phrase on whose king the king leaned. Anyway, back to the text. So now we see why these prices that we mentioned earlier are so relevant, knowing what we do. So let's keep a couple things in mind. They're in an environment currently where a donkey's head sells for 80 shekels of silver and a dove's dung or poop sells for 4. So we have nothing. So now all of a sudden in verse 1 and 2, we have Elisha telling the king and the captain, hey, tomorrow at this time, you'll be able to buy a pound of flour for 2 shekels, which, by the way, is just about the normal price, maybe a little elevated, but about the normal price. So that would be like me saying to you today, by tomorrow at noon, gas will be back at $1.50. Yeah, but you. If I told you that with emphatically that I believe it's going to be true, you'd be very cynical. Like, yeah, whatever, okay. And if I told you groceries were going to drop 25% tomorrow, we'd all be happy because we've seen the basic prices of every commodity we buy really go up in the last couple of years.
If our president told us that, we would be skeptical. Sorry.
That's true. If Joe Biden told us that, we would be skeptical. That is true. No, you don't have to be sorry. That's actually a better analogy. So the captain did not believe Elisha either. And you see what his response is. He says, if the Lord himself, and now you notice, I don't know how your Bible says it, but mine's in capital Lord. Okay? So that's saying if God himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? Well, I love the response of Elisha. Elisha says, well, you'll see it, but you'll never eat it. Why, just out of curiosity, why do you think that that was the response. Why do you think God said you'll never see it? Of course, we know what that means. It means he was going to be dead. Why? Why that response? What's your thoughts on that? Why would Elisha, or by proxy God, say you'll see it but not eat of it? What is the reason, you
It
think?
almost sounds disrespectful to God.
Yes, he does.
Besides his prophet.
What happened to Moses?
And it reminds me of Joshua and Caleb coming back and saying, yes, let's take it, let's go. The Lord's with us. And the Lord said, they'll see it.
Yes,
but
that's
they
true.
won't enjoy it.
That's true.
Right, Moses.
That's a good one. That's a real good one.
Moses got to see it, but not go into it.
That's true. Or, you didn't come to mocking God like you were saying. I remember what Steve said last week about, go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head. And that was little kids. We're talking kids here.
Yeah.
Came out and ate those kids, tore them up. So, and I made mention that I think it's one thing that the captain ridiculed Elisha and said, there's no way. But the fact that he said, if God himself
Yes.
will open windows, that's where he crossed the line.
He said God couldn't do it.
That's right. Yeah. And
That's wrong. I can't.
yeah. And essentially what he did too, in my thinking, is he took God's name in vain.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
blasphemous.
Yeah, it's blasphemous. And that's why, we've always said, I shudder when I hear people say, oh my, because you don't want to, this text that we're reading is a classic example of, they wouldn't even write God's name in here. They wrote Lord because his name was so respectful. They didn't even want to use his name in a way which would have been respectful. And so we have people today cavalierly using the name God, essentially taking God's name, and the Bible says he will not be held guiltless who takes his name in vain. And then I also thought of the verse in Galatians 6:7, which says, be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap. So God does not tolerate mocking him. So we have a promise here. Elisha says that God will provide, and tomorrow, by this time, we will have wheat at the normal prices, back to where they ought to be. You can buy beans and rice with no problems. So how we deliver on his promise? Well, verses 3 and 4. Now there were four men who were lepers at the entrance to the gate. And they said to one another, why are we sitting here until we die? If we say, let us enter the city, well, the famine is in the city and we shall die there. And if we sit here, well, we die also. So come now, let us go over to the camp of the Syrians. If they spare our lives, we shall live. And if they kill us, we shall but die. Well, I like their logic. So before we talk about these lepers, let me just give you some additional setting. Again, Steve did an exceptional job on this last week setting this up because he talked a good bit about lepers. So I don't have to go into that today. But we do know that lepers, as Steve said, are quarantined. They're not allowed in the general population. So they, in normal circumstances, would be in the same places they are here. Nothing's different with the lepers. They're living in the same spot they normally live in, which is outside the gate. And normally, the only sustenance or any provisions that the lepers would get would be from traffic going inside and outside the city, from people that would give them food, or people that threw stuff over the wall, trash and food. They would rumble through and get that. That was how they survived. So you can imagine if we have a donkey's head worth 80 shekels of silver, well, you got two issues here. First, you have no traffic going in and out the gates because the gates are locked. So there's nobody going through. So the people that might give them some food or take pity on a leper and throw them some food, there's none of that because there's no foot traffic. There's not the normal supply chain that's coming in and out of the city, bringing stuff from the fields, the barley, the wheat that's coming from all the fields around. There's none of that happening. So they have none of that. And there's no food coming over the wall. There's no garbage dump to go to rumble through and get any leftover food. There's nothing. So these lepers, while the people inside the city are in dire straits, eating anything, eating tree bark, roaches, rats, anything they can find to eat, these lepers are in worse, I'd say beyond deplorable. So they decided to do something. And when I read this Monday, there was a couple thoughts that came to my mind about these lepers and their decision to do something. Matter of fact, I had several things that crossed my mind, and I just wrote a few of them down. The first thing that came to my mind was that God puts a desire in humans, regardless of how bad it gets, we want to live, don't we? Our desire is to live. If I throw something at you right now, your natural reaction is to duck. Why? Because you don't want to get hurt and you don't want to die. If your vehicle, later on today, if you see a car coming head on, you're going to do everything you can to avoid it. Why? Because you want to live. It's innate in us to live. We want to live. We will do everything we can to avoid death. We don't, even and especially in our older age, we won't do any, except for Tommy, we won't do dangerous things. You know, she would bungee jump out of airplanes. Not me. I'm past that. I don't want to die. You know, I'm getting closer to death every day on my own. I don't want to expedite it. I don't want to fast forward it. You know, I might miss something. So it's inbred in us to want to live. To not want to live is not natural. And you look at suicides today. My goodness, the suicide rate, all of us have witnessed somebody. I mean, Tommy and I have just seen it just in the last month or so in Pell City. Just horrendous stories of people, and younger people especially. And we know that when you look at everything about God and about Jesus Christ, it's all about life, living. Everything about Satan, dark death. And if you look at what Satan is preaching through, either through abortion or through suicide or through drugs or through alcohol, everything is leading to expediting one to death quicker. Satan is all about death. That's all he is. He's just...
He doesn't want to give people more time to know the Lord.
Ma'am?
He doesn't want to give people more time to know the Lord.
Exactly. Yes, well
That's to
said.
kill, steal, and destroy.
Yes. And where everything with God and with Holy Spirit, with Jesus Christ, is all about living. It's all about life. I just looked up some suicide numbers yesterday. The ratio of suicide today is 13 per 100,000 individuals. That's really high. It's increasing 2% a year. Every year, another 2%. 132 suicides a day in our country. That's unbelievable.
There's a message. Tom and I, we very rarely watch weird channels, but we watched a movie on TV last night. And the commercial, almost every commercial was catered more towards teens. And every commercial was about 1 in 5 people has mental illness. We understand you're struggling. And the message was, there's something wrong with you. And they're hearing it and seeing it constantly. Hey, there's something wrong with you, even if there's not. Kids are getting that message of, oh, there must be something wrong with me. I think I have mental illness. And I'm not, and I don't want to.
Except for when you think you're a girl and want to be a man, then you don't have
Well,
yes.
that's what I'm saying. Well, and I don't want to mental illness is real.
Oh, it is.
And it's very serious. But I think that there is a message going out to our children and our teenagers that there's something wrong with you. Whether there is or not, they're getting bombarded with that message to think and to doubt, oh, I'm not okay. Maybe there is something wrong with me. Even though they're making perfectly fine. And I think that media, that our society, our culture is perpetuating that, when really I think it's causing more depression and it's causing more suicide than we would have otherwise.
Interesting take. Well, the other thing that occurred to me about these lepers is they made a decision. They had nothing to lose because they had nothing. I mean, they had nothing. Well, there's a couple things when I thought about that thought, when I wrote it down, that came to mind. One was, for some reason, was the song I Surrender All. You know, we grew up singing that song, I Surrender All. And I think that pretty much the general gist of the song is that what you're saying is that when you sing I Surrender All, you're saying that I surrender my will to do it my way, to get to heaven my way. I surrender to you, Lord. You know, I surrender to, that Jesus Christ is the way, the truth, the life. No man comes to the Father but through him. I think it's saying that, but I also wonder too if it's something more than that. I surrender all. In other words, I don't just surrender to you, but I surrender all that I have. Everything I have is yours. And we say that that everything we have is God's. But I wonder if God did like he did to Moses, says, I'm leading you to a land where I'm not even going to tell you where you're going. Your GPS has no destination. Just follow the GPS. Would we be willing to really leave behind everything you had? And the thing is about these lepers is they had nothing. So it was so much easier for them to make that decision. One of the things that I was talking to my son-in-law Sunday, and I just asked him, we were in the living room, Courtney was there, and my daughter, and we sold our house to him. So I told Caleb, I said, so, how do you like being a homeowner? It was interesting, the response from Courtney and from Caleb. Courtney said, well, I love that I don't have to ask permission for anything. If we want to do something here, it's our house. We can do whatever we want. She said, I've never lived in a house where I didn't have to ask the landlord or something where, could I do this? Can I paint this? Can I put this on the property? She says, we can do whatever we want because it's ours. And for her, that was liberating. Caleb, on the other hand, says, I feel locked down. He said, I don't feel like I have the freedom to just go. And I understood what he meant when he said that and I've understood both, by the way. I've understood what it's like to be a new homeowner, and it's yours, technically. It's not, but, it kind of is. And so, you have that freedom to do with what you want. But I understood Caleb, too, because, us not having a house right now, it is kind of liberating in a way. I know Tommy wants a house. I understand she wants a house. And I do, too. I'm not saying that I don't. But in a way, though, it's like I feel like these lepers, in just a weird way. Just hang on me, Tommy. I feel like these lepers. I have nothing to lose. If God called me to something right now, I'm not tied down.
You're available.
I'm available. There's nothing. I'd walk away from it all. I can't speak for Tommy, but I will say this of Tommy. She's the most supportive wife you could have. If I told her tomorrow we need to go to Yugoslavia, she would go. I don't doubt that at all. If
I can get animals there, but okay.
yeah, but she's a supporter. She might act like she's not, but she is. And when we were, it's weird because 20 years ago, almost to the month, we were in this same situation with no house. And there was during that period that she bought me a ring that had inside inscribed on it in Hebrew, where you go, I will go. So she's a supporter. And so I'm saying here that I understand these lepers. They had nothing to lose. And it's easier to make a decision when you're not bound by your stuff. You can follow God when you really make a commitment and say, I surrender all, and it's the hands off, and your stuff is not your stuff, it's really God's stuff. And all your investments and all your things that you have roots on, when you snip those roots, you really can be used by God. And that's where these lepers are. And by the way, these lepers kind of represent us. We're sinners. We're lepers, just like them. And everything that, everything the lepers had was provided by somebody else. They had nothing unless people's good grace gave it to them. Well, we're the same. Everything we have is through God's grace. We are afforded much more than we deserve through God's grace. And by the way, yes, ma'am, go
I
on.
was just gonna, add to that, it wasn't just the material things that, that they were tied down to or not tied down to, but it wasn't their minds that were tying them down either. They were the outcasts of society. They could have said, well, they wouldn't do it for us. Why should we do it for them? Let's just keep it here for ourselves.
Oh, yeah, that comes into play later. Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good, I like that. Yeah. I hadn't thought of it like that. It is good. And by the way, the decision of these lepers, since you said that, it's a good segue, not only is going to affect them, but we see later their decision is going to affect thousands of others. I don't know how many people live in Samaria, but the whole population. So in verse 5, we see them actually taking action on what they decided. And in verse 5, so they arose at twilight to go to the camp of the Syrians. But when they came to the edge of the camp of the Syrians, behold, there was no one there. So I'm in my mind, okay, this is what I do. I'm all about setting. You all never notice that with me? I'm all about setting. I have to know, in my mind, I have to know the I got to create this picture. So in my mind, I'm seeing the massive walls that where they're outside of, and I'm not sure how close the Syrians' camp is, but it's a pretty good walk. And so that walk, does yours? Mine says twilight. What time does your Bible say? In different dusk. Okay. So you have that mental picture of what time of day it is. So they're walking over there, not having any idea. By the way, I find it interesting that that would be the time they choose. But when they do go, they have no idea what to expect. In their minds, they've definitely played it out, because you see when they are talking amongst themselves, they said we might die. So they had an expectation that something could happen. So as they're walking, the four of them, towards this camp, they don't know, but that at any second there might be an arrow that comes right through their chest. They don't know that. I mean, they have no way of knowing what's going to happen. So their heart rates are up. They're not sure what to expect. That in any second they're waiting to hear halt or something. But as they get closer to the camp, there's nothing. And this is probably not what they expected. And then they get up to one of the tents and peek in, and nobody's there. And do you eventually say hello? Or anybody home? What do you do? And eventually they come to the conclusion there's really nobody there, and then there's all this food there, and it looks like all of a sudden that these people have left in a hurry, like maybe there's still some stuff on a little fire, that's cooking, and or who knows. But I'm trying to create this mental picture for myself and for you. But unbeknown to them, God had a plan. And we see the plan in verse 6, that God had already done something. For the Lord had made the army of the Syrians hear the sound of chariots and horses, and the sound of a great army. So they said to one another, Behold, the king of Israel hath hired against us the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to come against us. So they fled away in the twilight and abandoned their tents, their horses, their donkeys, leaving the camp as it was, and fled for their lives. So did you notice that the time is the same there? So in other words, this had to have happened pretty close to the time that these lepers had come. So I don't know how close the camp is to where the lepers were, but it must have been some distance, or you'd think they would have heard them all leaving. So the bottom line is, when they get up there, they see everything abandoned. I mean, those horses tied up, the donkeys are there. Everything was as it was. I mean, you could tell they left in a hurry. And so it says in verse 8, and when these lepers came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent, they ate and drank, they carried off silver and gold and clothing and went and hid them. Then they came back and entered another tent and carried off things from it and went and hid them. Well, there's been a lot of talk about the lottery in the last few days. It seems to be prevalent in the news. I guess somebody won it last night. But these guys felt like they won the lottery. I mean, they just got it all. And while they did have thoughts of hoarding, in the end, we see that they did what was right. And in verse 9, they said to one another, We are not doing right. This day is a day of good news. If we are silent and wait till the morning light, punishment will overtake us. Now therefore let us go, and tell the king's household. So they came, and they called to the gatekeepers of the city and told them, We came to the camp of the Syrians, and behold, there was no one to be seen there or heard there, nothing but horses tied and the donkeys tied, and the tents as they were. Well, just to give you a microcosm of this, the king doesn't believe it. He thinks it's a trick. Eventually, though, the king sends somebody, they send some horses, and then sure enough, they find out that all the Syrians are gone. I would have loved to have heard what they heard. It must have been one heck of a sound. It sounds to them like it's not just one army coming, but multiple armies coming with horses and chariots. And isn't God awesome? I mean, that's some serious PA system right there to put that kind of sound out there. And it must have sounded really realistic. But the point is, though, is that God provided. God provided for his people. And the thing about it is that God always provides, but he does it in such unconventional ways sometimes, doesn't he? Have you ever been there in your life where God just provided in an unconventional way? Does anybody have a story of something like that where God provided and it was in the weirdest way, but you knew it was God. Anybody have a story like that in your life that you can think of?
Well, it, not very dramatic in a way, but.
It doesn't have to be.
We were in school and lived in an apartment, had very little. Darren worked anyway. And, I guess we could use money, and just out of the blue, we went to the mailbox and we had a refund. Evidently it'd been a year, and they refunded the utility deposit or whatever. There was money, and we joked all through the years, every time we go to the mail, I said, well, did anybody send us any money today? Because, God can send you whatever he wants you to need. So,
Yes, he can.
We had one when we were young parents of one, and Tom had paid all the bills, and it got to the point, he said, we can't pay these last two bills, we don't have the money. And we went, okay, well, we've tithed, we've been obedient, we've lived frugally, we're gonna trust that the Lord's gonna provide. And that was like on a Saturday. So that next night, we were living in Omaha, Nebraska at the time. And the next day, afternoon, my mom called, we were talking, and she said, oh, by the way, your granddaddy decided to sell some calves. And you know how sometimes randomly my granddaddy would would take the money from one calf and give my brother half the money and give me half the money. But he hadn't done that in years at that point. And she said, so your granddaddy took some calves to the sale, and for one of the calves, he sent your brother some money, and you should be getting a check. So we got the check that week, and to the penny, it was what we needed to pay the bills. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's awesome. Joe?
In 2002, I was deliberating over leaving Southeastern Bible College for a time because we started having kids and everything. And so I was working part-time, and so I was praying to the Lord about a job. And I didn't know, what he wanted me to do because I was going to have all this time on my hands. So I knew I needed to get a full-time job. So I'm sitting there praying around 8:30 in the morning about, I need a job. I know it's your will for me to care for my family, so I need something very, very, very soon. 2 hours later, I get a call from a job that I put in an application for 6 months prior, saying, are you still interested? And it turns out, as I was praying, he was firing the individual whose place I
Oh,
would
wow.
take.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's those little moments in our life that we know that when we're provided for, that, first of all, it's really humbling to me. I can't speak for you. But God is so big. He's so huge. He's so awesome. When he notices me, it is really humbling. I mean, we would think it, from man's perspective, regardless of what you think of our current president, if the White House called you, you'd be honored that the White House called you. I mean, they don't just call anybody. But when God, the creator of the universe, did you see that recent picture that they released of all the galaxies that was just out? Whew. Okay, that God, that has all of that in order, where everything moves and it doesn't crash, it's all in order. That God notices beyond me. It's very humbling.
Like Shelley was saying, they got the money in the mail just for those particular bills. It's not like they got a new car or
Yeah,
anything like
yeah.
that. But
There
it's
was
just-
nothing extra.
It's exciting
Exactly what
to us, so, it makes you feel really good when you see it's just, you know what I'm saying?
I do know exactly what you're saying.
It's not a new car, but it met our needs, and we notice that. We see that that's from God.
And so the world might say that's foolish, but there's a verse in 1 Corinthians that says, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. But it's those little things that others say that are weak that to us are strong.
That's how he helps us grow our faith.
Yes.
Definitely.
God
Know
keeps
we can trust him.
his promises. And what we need to learn is not only does he keep his promises, but sometimes we need to learn to expect the unexpected from God. And third, as we all have just said, he does it in ways that we know it's him. It wasn't coincidence. We know it was him.
We used a phrase several years ago when we were telling people about what God had done. And so, we have a gazillion stories of how God has worked in those ways. But I said a phrase one time, and I said, we're amazed
Hmm.
we ask God for this. So we're amazed at how he does it, but we're not surprised because we know he will.
That's good. I like that. Well, our God is a God who can be relied on. So that's our lesson today. God provides. He provided then. Yes, ma'am.
So the sound of the armies, there was the sound of marching in the balsam trees when David was going out to, he was fighting the Philistines or somebody. So it's like, it's the same thing.